I'm Dom Nicholls, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, as the world prepares for this week's summit in Alaska, European foreign ministers are meeting to try to produce what Gabrielis Landsbergis calls a shadow of power. Plus, we report on yet another very long-range strike by Ukraine against Russian energy infrastructure. We hear how Italy may be about to become a world leader in the production of political fudge. And we hear the latest postcard from Adelie in Ukraine.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
Russia does not want peace.
Erstens, wir verteidigen mit unserer Hilfe für die Ukraine auch unsere Freiheit und unsere europäischen Werte.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Monday, the 11th of August, 3 years and 170 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, I'm joined by the Telegraph's executive editor for audio, Francis Dearnley, and Adelie Pojzman-Pontay. I started by introducing what will undoubtedly become the biggest story of the week, if not the year. So let's start with the updates. I've lost count, Francis, lost count of how often we've said it is going to be a big week, but this one really will be. This summit in Alaska on Friday between Trump, Putin, maybe some others, possibly Zelensky. We don't know the details of exactly where and when, but just to let you know, folks, we've asked the White House for accreditation, journalist accreditation, so hopefully we will be there. If not, the Telegraph's US team will be, and we'll be tying in with them. So we're not exactly sure how we're going to be covering it. Any announcement from that summit will probably be Friday evening, Friday night in the US, early hours, very early hours of Saturday for Europe, and kind of Saturday morning / arvo for Australia and New Zealand. So our plans for covering it are going to firm up during the week, and we'll let you know what we're going to be doing. Now, ahead of that, US Vice President J.D. Vance, who's on holiday in the UK at the moment, actually, he said yesterday that neither side, Russia nor Ukraine, is likely to be content with the terms of any agreement, appearing to suggest the current front lines would be frozen and territory exchanged. He was speaking to Fox News. He said both the Russians and the Ukrainians probably, at the end of the day, are going to be unhappy with it. Now, there is a school of thought that says any negotiation, both sides should be a little bit grumpy. That's how negotiations work, but it's all about the degree of unhappiness. Anyway, European leaders put out a statement over the weekend. They're meeting today at the foreign minister level to get their house in order. More on that shortly from Francis. But on to the military updates. And over the weekend, largely characterised by yet more very long-range Ukrainian drone strikes against Russian energy infrastructure. The Ukrainian General Staff reported yesterday on an attack overnight Sunday on the Saratov oil refinery near Saratov city. That's a mere 400 kilometres east of Ukraine. I mentioned that first because it was pretty much the closest. Then Russian opposition outlet Astra reported that Ukrainian forces struck the Lukoil refinery in Ukhta. That's in Komi Republic. The first time this part of Russia has ever been hit over the weekend with at least one drone. Geolocated footage published yesterday shows damage to a tank at the refinery. That's over 1,000 kilometres northeast of Moscow. So I couldn't even do the numbers for Ukraine. 1,000 kilometres northeast of Moscow. And then today, there are reports that drones operated by the SBU, the security service of Ukraine, hit a plant in Russia's Nizhny Novgorod Oblast that is said to produce components for cruise missiles. A source in the SBU is speaking to the Kyiv Independent. They've got the story up online. That's a bit closer. That's only 500 kilometres east of Moscow. So the source said this morning, long-range drones of the SBU's Special Operations Centre A hit the production facilities of the Arzamas instrument building plant located in Russia's Nizhny Novgorod Oblast. Now, the statement follows reporting about a Ukrainian drone strike in that area, with the local regional Russian Governor Gleb Nikitin, claiming that 2 industrial zones in the region had come under attack. That plant, which is, it's noted, under sanctions from the EU, the US, Ukraine and New Zealand, I don't think the UK actually, but under sanctions from a wide number of actors, is said to produce gyroscopic instruments, control systems and other components for Russian Kh-32 and Kh-101 cruise missiles. Now, on the ground in Ukraine, little move again, bar a sort of 2-kilometre push or thrust, if you like, by Russia northeast of Pokrovsk. They must have found a gap and they've pushed some people through there, managed to hang on under the inevitable drone strike. So just northeast of Pokrovsk, a couple of Ks northeast, Russia managed to push basically due north by about 1 kilometre or 2 kilometres there. Otherwise, aerial attacks across Ukraine continued over the weekend, leading to numerous civilian deaths and injuries, including at least 20 people who were injured when Russia hit the city of Zaporizhia with guided aerial bombs yesterday. Governor Ivan Fedorov there said the first bomb struck a busy bus station in the city and the second one hit a university medical clinic. Across the country, just yesterday alone, 7 killed and nearly 50 injured. Writing on Telegraph, Mr. Fedorov said of the bus attack, "This is terror. We must call things by their proper names." Now, the Kyiv Independent, again, reporting another story this morning, saying a resident of Russia's Belgorod Oblast has expressed outrage after a Russian jet purportedly dropped a bomb on civilian property. This is the story, citing an alleged intercepted phone call released by the HUR, Ukraine's military intelligence, the HUR, on Sunday. Now, a woman on the recording is said to have reported, "It's terrible. At 5 o'clock there was a huge explosion and those were our planes. They were spotted on radar and to avoid getting hit, they dropped it," that's a bomb, "on a vegetable garden. Why are they flying over populated areas?" Now, there is quite a lot to unpack there. How did the woman know that these jets were spotted on radar? Why might they have felt they were about to be hit and therefore have to jettison their stores, as in drop the bombs? And what has the Russian Air Force got against vegetable gardens? Anyway, I mention it because it seems to have happened, but quite what happened, no one's exactly sure, or why. A couple more from me. Interesting stats published today by the Institute for the Study of War, the US-based think tank. They say Russian tank losses appear to be declining. They say it's because Russian forces continue to deprioritise mechanised assaults up and down the front line, suggesting that the Russian command has recognised that it can't protect vehicles from Ukrainian drones. I think that's partly correct. It's probably also because they are running low on equipment, including refurbished old stock or the very old T-62s. We've even seen some T-54, 55s, one gap 4, if you know your armoured fighting vehicle recognition handbook. I think they're probably preserving what they have, prioritising the more modern stuff for any future operations. Anyway, ISW say that Russian tank loss rates began to decrease in December 2024, and they say that is consistent with the Russian military command's theatre-wide shift from these very costly mechanised assaults towards the gradual creeping infantry assaults, the kind of meat assaults, as we've been speaking of most recently in the last few months, being conducted by motorcycle, sometimes e-scooter, we've seen, just trying to get through, grab some ground, go firm and defend against the inevitable drones that then come in. They're trying to do this sort of inch by inch, piecemeal, grab and hold type strategy. Okay, I've got a few more. US Vice President J.D. Vance, as I mentioned at the start, he was speaking to Fox News yesterday, made it clear that the Trump administration will no longer directly fund the Ukrainian military effort, but is going to allow Europe to buy weapons from the US for Ukraine. We've reported that over the last couple of weeks. Now, that position was further informed by NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte. He gave an interview to Face the Nation, and that was also published yesterday. Now, Mr. Rutte, what he called the floodgate, his word, floodgate of lethal aid for Ukraine, opened after he met Donald Trump on July the 14th. I think was that the whole daddy thing? Anyway, now this side of it, this is going to be financed, or at least the majority of it, we think, through this new Bank for Defence, Security and Resilience. That's this international bank being set up to focus on lending to NATO and other partner countries for defence procurement, specifically for Ukraine, but also for national defence as well. More on that a little bit later. But I would point you towards a Polish TV company, TVP. They put out a good 2-minute video explainer of what the bank is, the Defence Security and Resilience Bank. They put out a little explainer on Friday. We'll put a link in the episode notes to that. Now the next one, Igor Shushko, who's a researcher, a journalist from the Wind of Change research group. He's pointing us to a story in the Swiss press. saying that a Swiss army colonel has been recalled from a posting abroad after being accused of passing information to Russia in summer 2024, citing Swiss public broadcaster SRF. Now, this chap was supposed to have had over 20 years' service in the Swiss military and until mid-2024 worked at the Swiss representation to the OSCE, the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe. That's based in Vienna. However, his posting and indeed his service has been suspended after being suspected of having passed on information to Russia last summer. Now, there is some comment saying that he's been unfairly treated, saying the suspension is disproportionate and based on a single incident in which he gave a document to the Russian delegation in Vienna, which, okay, it still did it. But the suggestion is that that document was shared across the entire OSCE just a few hours later, so it was only a little leak. And now Swiss broadcaster SRF says the case is being investigated by both the Defence Ministry and intelligence services. Now, one final one for me. Yet more evidence, I think, of Putin's grip on the Caucasus slipping, something that friend and colleague James Kilner has been speaking about for months now. Azerbaijani President Ilham Aliyev signed an order earlier today allocating $2 million to the Azerbaijani Energy Ministry to provide humanitarian aid to Ukraine. This comes from Azerbaijani media outlet First News Media. Now, this follows a series of Russian strikes on Ukrainian energy infrastructure linked to Azerbaijan, including drone strikes just last Friday against an Azerbaijan state oil company depot in Odessa Oblast. A diesel pipeline was damaged there and 4 workers injured. That was the second recent Russian strike on Azerbaijani-linked facilities in Ukraine after an attack on a gas distribution station near Orlivka in June. That was part of the Trans-Balkan pipeline that then began carrying Azerbaijani gas to Ukraine in July. Now, Azerbaijani outlet Caliber.az reported yesterday that Baku may consider lifting its ban on supplying Ukraine with weapons if Russia continues targeting Azerbaijani interests. One to watch there, I think. Okay, that's enough for me going on. Now, Francis, this week, I mentioned it's yet another big week in politics. I reckon we're going to hear two main themes, two main narratives from Russia this week. Number one, that Zelensky is an obstacle to peace, wanting to be present in Alaska, insisting on no territorial concessions, being unwilling to recognise the reality on the ground, if not the historical reality in Putin's eyes. And secondly, and similarly, we're going to hear that Europe is a sea anchor on Donald Trump's dinghy of pursuing peace by wanting to continue funding the war. Russia's going to say they're keen to fight the last Ukrainian, etc., etc. They're going to say that Europe's insistence on being present and all the rest of it just continues the war when dear old Moscow would love for the whole thing to be over. Anyway, that's me and my view. What's your reading of the Alaska summit upcoming? And should we expect anything of substance from today's European foreign ministers reporting or meeting?
Well, thanks, Dom. Where should we start? I think it's helpful to take us back to Friday, first of all. Last week, of course, all the talk was of Friday's deadline imposed on Russia by Donald Trump. Putin had to agree to a ceasefire or face crushing sanctions. Now, we start today, Monday, with no ceasefire, no such sanctions enacted beyond that additional 25% on India already in place. And instead, this meeting scheduled between Trump and Putin for this Friday without, as things stand, the Ukrainians or the Europeans. So how did we get here? The short chronology, though there are lots of disparate interpretations at the moment, is that Steve Witkoff, Trump's envoy, suggested to President Trump after his meeting with Putin that the Russian position had shifted quite considerably. Now, the default Kremlin position, as we know, is that Russia demands full control of 5 Ukrainian regions before stopping its offensive and is only offering, if indeed it's even offering this, limited ceasefires, such as no strikes on power plants. The US apparently proposed freezing the war along current lines in exchange for lifting most sanctions, which Moscow rejected. But then, incredibly, Witkoff apparently, among other misunderstandings, misread a Russian demand for Ukraine to withdraw as a Russian offer to withdraw. So to be specific, according to the Wall Street Journal, Trump told Western leaders after meeting with Witkoff the following: Russia would be ready to withdraw from the southern region of Zaporizhia and Kherson in exchange for full control of Donetsk. However, Witkoff walked back that claim the next day in a call with the chief aides of European leaders, suggesting Russia would both withdraw and freeze the front line. Then, European leaders demanded a third call with Witkoff to clarify the growing confusion about what Putin had actually proposed. In that call, Witkoff stated that the only offer on the table was for Ukraine to withdraw unilaterally from Donetsk in exchange for a ceasefire. But by then, President Trump had given the green light for a summit in Alaska. Now, the US state was once part of the Russian Empire, purchased back by the US in the 1860s, 1867, I think. It lies just across the Bering Strait from Russia. At their closest point, the two are less than 3 miles apart. So it is, whether by intention or design, a symbolic choice, given the state's relationship with the two countries and it being land traded at a negotiating table. Trump said, we're going to get some land back and we're going to get some switched. There'll be some swapping of territories to the betterment of both. So, after all of what I've just said, to be clear, as far as we know, there is no suggestion that the Russians or the Ukrainians have agreed to swapping any land at all. So it could be that this entire summit is built on a mistranslation, which would be, well, staggeringly inept diplomacy, if so. And once again, things have, as a consequence, fallen very favourably for Putin. He has secured something he's wanted since January, a one-on-one meeting with Trump, no further sanctions, and no ceasefire. Plus, the prospect of driving a wedge between Ukraine and Europe. Bear in mind, Putin is still a wanted war criminal by the International Criminal Court, which, of course, Washington is not a signatory to. He was once persona non grata in many parts of the world following the illegal invasion of Ukraine. He's now, in effect, having the red carpet rolled out for him by the leader of the free world on American soil. It is a remarkable turnaround of fortune, and no wonder Russian propagandists are cock a hoop. One Russian newspaper put it this way: no British spies here, Ukrainian agents or European well-wishers to disrupt the dialogue. Now, suffice to say, the Ukrainians and the Europeans, as you say, Dom, have not been sitting on their hands as this unfolded. In a frenetic weekend, there have been calls and major meetings between leaders and officials, sometimes involving the US. Vice President Vance, who, as you say, is staying with the British Foreign Secretary David Lammy at the moment here in the UK, and Lammy has had several senior Ukrainian officials round, was talking to the media and said, along those things you've already talked about, certain positions which seem to diverge a fair bit from what Trump was actually saying. So he said that Trump had managed to move Putin from a position of saying he'd never meet Zelensky to being willing to do so. But as we said last week, even if Putin does say theoretically yes to meeting Zelensky, and he alluded to that in vague terms last week, it is predicated always on certain conditions which are not present, and even then there's no guarantee that he would actually do so. He could shake hands with Trump and then just depart, saying that there wasn't enough room for manoeuvre, as it were. Now, Vance also referred to the contact line in the interview. So no talk of swapping land, adding, we're going to try and find some negotiated settlement the Ukrainians and Russians can live with. So again, this is a different interpretation of what this summit is actually about. But even that, if the Witkoff-Trump position is, as it were, a firmer one than J.D. Vance's, it's still arguably, Vance's, has more in line with the words of the US NATO ambassador Matthew Whitaker over the weekend when he said this: no big chunks or sections are going to just be given that haven't been fought for or earned on the battlefield. Earned on the battlefield. That is perhaps the starkest mandating of imperialism one could ever imagine hearing from a diplomat. The fact is, it's barely been talked about. And I would say that that is indicative of how things have changed in the last few years. But just to take us back to Ukraine's allies, as you say, Dom, meetings taking place today. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte saying that the alliance's coordinated supply of weapons to Ukraine will continue regardless of the outcome of the meeting. At the same time, you've got the Nordic Baltic 8 nations releasing a strong statement saying that it will remain at Ukraine's side, united in purpose and resolute in defence of our security, saying they'll continue to uphold and impose restrictive measures and that peace will only come through a combination of determined diplomacy, unwavering support for Ukraine and consistent pressure on the Russian Federation to halt its unlawful war. But the fact is that Europe has, despite all its big talk about the coalition of the willing, not put itself into a position where it would have to be part of any talks. One simply could not hold a summit between Russia and the US alone if there were, for instance, European troops stationed in Kyiv, or whether certain pledges had been made about maintaining parts of Ukraine's territorial integrity by force if necessary. As Lithuania's former Foreign Minister Gabrielius Landsbergis put it, with all due respect to the Europeans, emphasising that Ukrainians and Europeans need to be at the table, I agree, but to achieve what? As George P. Shultz famously said, negotiations are a euphemism for capitulation if the shadow of power is not cast across the negotiating table. What have we achieved in the last 6 months that would strengthen Ukraine's position? What shadow are we prepared to cast? Or is this just one more episode in the attempt to lead us into accepting Ukraine's capitulation? Now, for now, it seems that the best Europe can do is provide cover for Zelensky. So when this summit does fall apart, it's not him to blame, but due to the collective European position. What Rutte and others will be relying on is the pledges made at the NATO summit by Trump about Article 5 and that profitable deal struck selling weapons to Europe being purchased by European powers and then sent on to Ukraine. While it does feel unlikely the White House would pull out of those profitable deals and therefore some progress has been made, we have to ask ourselves, when a relationship is built only on money and sycophancy, what is to stop that person going elsewhere for those two things? As Professor Sam Green of King's College London puts it well, as things stand, Ukraine and Europe are on the verge of being confronted with exactly the kind of Faustian deal they feared would emerge back in February. The fact Europe hasn't moved to block such a deal in the past 6 months is a failure of leadership and diplomacy. Europe had a choice. It could fight for a seat at the US-Russia table and thereby create agency for itself and Ukraine. Or it could create another table entirely. Europe has consistently chosen the former. Hence where we are. Thus, Ukraine is caught between two fatal delusions. The first is America's delusion that Russia will provide security for Ukraine. It can't and won't. The second is Europe's delusion that its security must run through America. Not anymore. Security for Ukraine and Europe depends on the two coming together to insulate themselves from Washington and construct deterrence against Moscow. The talks that really matter then aren't the ones in Alaska next week. They're the ones in Europe right now. And in the end, the Trump-Putin pact's power depends on others supporting it. The honourable thing to do would be not to support it. If Europe stands with Ukraine, the pact will last for just a short moment in Alaska. So just to bring things to a close, it's worth reminding ourselves that even if a deal was put forward to the Ukrainians by Moscow and Washington, one they were compelled to sign in order to get a ceasefire, territory has never really been Putin's goal in this war. It won't solve the innate problems. Russia's objectives remain undermining the sovereignty of Ukraine. And all the key agreements Russia signed way back in 1997 about friendship and cooperation with the country have proven to be not worth the paper that they are written on. So the idea that this would be the great big breakthrough, I think, is simply for the birds based on our understanding of the Kremlin's approach. There would be benefits for them of getting a ceasefire if they get certain territory agreed, but it would not even then end the subject at hand. The last time an American president sat down with a Russian autocrat to carve up parts of Europe was 80 years ago in Potsdam. No one then attended from the countries whose fate was being decided. Something similar is in danger of unfolding in Alaska this week, and history suggests time and time again it rarely ends well. So let's see whether the Europeans and Ukrainians can do enough to change the calculus over the coming days.
Well, thanks, Francis. Now, let's just have a quick chat about that. Now, we're not going to do this to death because it'll be a very long week if each day we go, what do you think is going to happen in Alaska and all that kind of jazz. So we won't go massive, but let's have a little think about this. I mean, you are correct that Putin's maximalist aims have not changed one jot. The whole sovereignty, denazification, all that kind of rubbish is obviously still there. But what realistically does Putin think he can get out of this summit on Friday? And I think it comes down to two things. The de facto, if not de jure, recognition of Russian ownership, for ease of language, of the 5 oblasts, Crimea and the 4 in the southeast. Obviously, he holds most of Luhansk, but the other 3, Zaporizhia, Kherson and Donetsk, he's got about 75%. So nowhere near all of them. But, you know, if he comes out of it with those 5, he would be happy. And a relief of sanctions. So that's, I think, what he will hope to get out of it. That's what he's pitching for. You know, the whole position of America at the moment under this administration is just, it's quite depressing to see. The business with India, Russia's such a, what did he say? It didn't say existential threat to the US.
Extraordinary threat.
Yeah, you're such an extraordinary threat to me. You are, so I'm going to punch that bloke in the face over there. So Russia's an extraordinary threat to the US, so they levied 25% tariffs on India in 21 days' time. I mean, it's just rubbish. But let's see. So Putin wants to get, I think, those two things out of this week. If Ukraine turns around and says, we don't care, we're not going to sign anything, it's a load of old rubbish, what's the worst case? What could the US could cut off? We've seen bits of this before, but what could the US do? They could cut off intelligence support, and that would be significant. The intelligence support would be serious. Weapon supplies? Well, I mean, they're pretty much burnt through all the drawdowns under the Biden administration. The numbers at the moment given to me by a very senior defense official in the last week was that at the moment Ukraine is producing 55% of its own weapons. Europe is providing 25%, and the US the remaining 20%. Now that 20% is dwindling. So Ukraine is producing most of its weapons. Of course, the elephant in the room is air defense. So Ukraine is not producing anything like the Patriots that can bring down ballistic missiles. So yes, it would be significant if the US pulled out of the intelligence support. It would be bad, arguably not catastrophic, if they cut off weapon supplies. So the questions then are, well, if the US said, right, well, here's the best chance of a deal, back to what I said earlier on about the Russian narratives this week, if the US buy into it and say, you know what, Zelensky, you're now a barrier to peace. Here's Russia in good faith trying to come up with a way of ending the carnage, and you're standing in the way. So if the US pull out completely, what will Europe do? What can Europe do? Can Europe step up? Arguably they can. This new bank, there's a funding mechanism now. Money is not the problem. Will they? That is a very interesting question. So far, they've not really covered themselves in glory. If the US stepped back and either Europe did nothing or lent into it, would that count as a fracture of NATO? Has the idea of collective defence gone now? I mean, the fact that you've got this meeting with Russia, arguably the whole reason for NATO right now, does that mean that NATO is effectively no longer what it was? And does that matter? And even if in the back of his mind, in Donald Trump's mind, he is concerned about this being him going down in history as the architect of the end of NATO, would you get some Russian-leaning members of maybe Hungary or Slovakia saying, no, don't worry, Donald, NATO is safe. This is an entirely separate and distinct foreign policy problem. So the ball is very much I think, here in Europe's court to step up. And you know what Russia is, you know what this US administration is. You've got no excuse now, Europe, for not coming out and saying, right, well, if we're serious about supporting Ukraine, then we're going to step up. Question 4. Donald Trump is, if you accept that this is how the world is now, in the context of increased tension and as a way to diffuse potential military flashpoints with China, would the US welcome territorial concessions by Taiwan? That would be an interesting question that might be put to him. But could Europe step up? The very senior defence official I was speaking to in the last week said that this idea of the coalition of the willing, remember that? Haven't heard about that for a while. But the official was saying, actually, it's in not a bad place. So to your point about, well, Europe needs to put skin in the game, I hate the word game, but if this coalition of the willing is in some capacity ready to go, maybe Europe would push that in there in order to ensure buy-in from everybody else. But I do come back to this, this is Europe's moment, and those comments by Donald Tusk a few weeks ago saying, why should Europe of 500 million people keep looking to 350 million Americans to protect us from 150 million Russians? I mean, that's it in a nutshell. And nobody in Europe has yet answered that. I don't think we're going to get an answer today from this foreign ministers meeting. But, I mean, by God, now's the time to start putting flesh on those bones. Any comments on any of that?
I mean, I would just say I will share the frustration that no doubt many people listening to this will be feeling, that we've just been here so many times, haven't we, particularly on the European charge. How many times have we said that this is Europe's fight and that it had to put itself into a position that meant that it would always have to be taken seriously as a key player if it got to the point that a deal between Trump and Putin looked like a possibility. A deal, obviously, one that can't be agreed without that the Ukrainians agreeing to it, but they could strike something which makes things very, very difficult politically to try and move things forward. And so it's an immeasurably frustrating position for us to be in. But as you say, Dom, it could be worse given where we were a few months ago. Basically, if this had been what had happened back in February, it would be more serious than today, I think, because
the White House spat.
Yes, yeah. I think if they then said, right, Trump and Putin are going to be meeting the next week, there would have been such a scramble, such a panic. There has been some buffers put in place in Europe to support Ukraine if the worst case scenario happens. But we are still gambling on the idea that, as I said earlier on, the relationship between NATO, the purchasing of weapons, then handed over to Ukraine, that will continue indefinitely. And if it doesn't continue, then there needs to be something in place pretty quickly to ensure that if there were to be some kind of full withdrawal of support for Ukraine in military terms, including the purchasing, including the no longer permitting of spare parts to be purchased and sold on, then it's very serious. So we will have to see. But I think that it is just staggering that we are here again.
It is. And I think, your point there about panic, I think there should be more panic. I'd welcome a bit more panic from European leaders and foreign policy. I didn't want the Oval Office to go any worse than it already was, which was an absolute car crash. But yeah, I welcome some panic from Europe, please. I mean, it's really the Poles, Donald Tusk, Radoslaw Sikorski and the Baltic states. They are saying this stuff and they're putting their money where their mouths are. I am worried about Europe's response. And now for the final dispatch from Adelie after her recent trip to Ukraine.
Hi gang, hi London. I am finishing my trip to Ukraine. I'm currently in transit through Warsaw today, where I've just arrived after the night train from Kyiv that I boarded last night. Had a lovely night. I just love a night train, and this one was particularly comfortable and no one snored. So, it's always an added bonus when you don't have Dom snoring next to you throughout the night. Before I head back to London, I just wanted to tell you a little bit about a city I was in on Saturday for an interview. I can't tell you much about the interview itself, but I travelled for the day to Vinnytsia. It's a city about a 3 or 4 hour train ride south of Kyiv, And it was a very gorgeous day. It was a Saturday. It was very warm, very sunny. And the city, as my fixer Alex described it, is like typical Central European with an Austrian vibe. The city centre had quite low buildings from like the 19th century, very pretty, very Habsburgish in a way, like a Viennese vibe. And the centre of the city had been entirely pedestrianised. So it was very quiet, very peaceful, with a lot of cafes around. And because it was Saturday, you could see families just like going about their business, going for lunch, kids playing in the water fountain. It was very lovely. Obviously, the signs of war are still present if you look for them. In the centre of the square, there was a little patch of Ukrainian flags for the fallen heroes of the city. And not quite in the city centre, but in the surrounding areas, you could see a few buildings boarded up. But overall, it seemed to be a very lovely and peaceful city, also with a lot of very beautiful churches everywhere. Now, I think Venezia is a little bit interesting because it's a city that has been at the heart of Ukrainian history throughout the 20th century. In the revolution in 1917, 1920, it was designated as a potential centre for the Ukrainian government. Back then, it was a very industrial city, which was at the heart of the sugar industry, with a lot of confectionery plants in Ukraine. It is still a very industrial centre where the sugar industry is located. Actually, the former Ukrainian president, Petro Poroshenko, owns a lot of these factories. He's also an MP for the area, although I've read that he's actually never lived there. So, yeah, bit of a raised eyebrow there. I feel like MPs should have a home base in the places they represent, but that's only me. What else? It's been quite heavily bombed in 2022 because the headquarters of the Ukrainian armed forces are located in Venezia. And so I've read that the command center was pretty damaged by a cruise missile in March 2022, and then again 3 cruise missiles in July 2022. There was even, you might remember in October 2022, a case of a Ukrainian pilot, Vadim Voroshilov, who destroyed 3 Shahids near Venezia, and he was awarded the title of Hero of Ukraine, and that was quite notable back then. At the center of the square, there's actually an old water tower that is now a bell tower. And before it was marking the time, the chiming clock would play the Ukrainian national anthem, which does mean I've had the national anthem of Ukraine stuck in my mind as an earworm for the past 48 hours. It was very, very beautiful. But, you know, as lovely and sunny this day was, and as peaceful the city center seemed, the war is never very far. During our interview, we were interrupted by the sound of sirens for a potential ballistic threat. It didn't last very long, maybe like 15 minutes. But, you know, you just are talking with someone, and in the middle of it erupts the sound of sirens. I need to figure out what you're going to do and whether you're going to go down to the shelter or not. So you'll also hear that. Now I'm travelling back to London, sad to be leaving Ukraine behind. 8 days is always too short whenever I'm there. I have so many ideas of things I want to do and people I want to meet. But one thing that I really love about hopping on the night train from Kyiv is that Ukrainian train stations always have music playing on the platform, and it's very, very lovely to hear. So that will be the final recording that you'll hear during this postcard. It is the sound of the music from the platform in Kyiv and the train taking me back to good old London and the Telegraph Towers. I'll talk to you all tomorrow. Thank you very much for tuning in. Bye-bye.
And to illustrate quite why I'm so worried about Europe, let's go to Italy. Italy has finally approved, it's been going on for decades, a 13.5 billion euro, 12 billion quid, about 14 billion US dollars, plan to build the world's longest suspension bridge from the mainland to Sicily across the Strait of Msina from Calabria in southern Italy. All good. Giorgia Meloni's government, however, has indicated that it will classify the Msina Bridge as a strategic investment, meaning it will be counted as defence spending to help Italy meet NATO's military expenditure target. Italy currently pays less than 2% GDP for defence. You'll remember NATO summit in The Hague. NATO said it's now going to be 5% is the spending target, 3.5% on heavy metal and 1.5% on wider defence spending, including infrastructure. Now, at the time, I expressed concern that there would be a huge amount of fudge around this, both of those numbers, the 3.5% of hard metal and the 1.5% would be spent on. I expected states to be very clever in their accounting about how to hide all that fudge. Well, you know, it looks like the Italians have done themselves proud. I mean, you can't hide a bloody great bridge across the 2 miles of the strait there. Looks like the Msina Bridge is going to be that first batch of fudge. And this is why I worry about Europe and defence spending and looking at the threat and going, well, it's fine, it's not going to happen here. All this sort of stuff. Hat tip to listener Chris. Thank you, Chris, for pointing me towards the bridge and all the fudge that flows through and under and on top of it. Francis, what's your final thoughts for Monday?
Well, we've got another contestant in what you call the Open Window Diving Championships.
Oh, good.
So this is Dmitry Kozak, deputy head of Putin's administration. He's recently urged Putin to stop the war and begin peace talks. This is coming from the New York Times over the weekend, citing undisclosed sources. Now, Kozak's a long-time Putin ally, but he was, and I remember his name many times over the years, one of the few senior Russian officials privately opposed to the war, and he presented a plan to end the hostilities alongside proposals, this time for internal reforms. He'd previously warned about the risks of fierce Ukrainian resistance, and after it began, tried to unsuccessfully negotiate a truce. Now, I'm not saying we should read too much into this, but I would underscore the fact that there is increased evidence, as we spoke about last week, that the Russian economy is not in a good place. The immense deficit is staggering and much, much higher than people expected. And so it is possible, and there are many voices who argue this, that there are those in the Russian state who are saying, look, it's now or never. It's very well and good to appear strong and to be ramping up defence measures, ramping up weapons procurement, but we cannot do this indefinitely, and it's now time to cut and run, as it were. And so I'm not saying I necessarily completely agree with that argument. I tend to think that this war has made Russian society such a war economy, such a fascistic state, it's very difficult for it to stop very easily. But nonetheless, there are perhaps voices in the society who are recognising just how serious and precarious the situation is for the Russian economy and therefore for the support for the regime. So I mention it here just because it's one of those markers that if things do go awry in the months, perhaps years ahead, this is one of those signals of another opportunity that was missed for Putin to turn things around.
Well, I think that's why he'll have limited aims from this week. He will accept something less than his maximalist aims because of all those indicators, but with a view to coming back in 5-10 years' time, what have you. But interesting. So that's it, folks. Start of another long week. Sorry, we keep saying that. It's going to be another long week. We will try and keep abreast of it as best we can, bring you the news, analysis and opinion. And we don't sort of put them under different headings. I'm surprised how many people do email us. Actually, it's not that many that complain about mainstream media that has an opinion. I think we make it quite clear when we're giving news. And that's just my bugbear. Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. You can also now sign up to the new Ukraine the Latest weekly newsletter. Each week, Francis and I answer your questions, provide recommended reading, and give exclusive analysis and behind-the-scenes insights, plus maps of the front lines and diagrams of weapons, to complement our daily reporting. It's free for everyone, including non-subscribers. You can find the link to sign up in the descriptions for this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine live blog on our website where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciate our work, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow the Telegraph so that you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You'll find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Rachel Porter. Executive producers are Francis Dearnley, Louisa Wells and David Knowles.
My name is David Knowles. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye.